I could use the regular microphone. I'll use the regular microphone, but I'll stand up here. Or shall I use this? Okay. Okay. Hi, everyone. I don't want people to get antsy that we haven't started yet, because I know it's past 6:30. But we're still giving more people a chance to park their cars, since parking's so limited around here. And there's people downstairs. Hi, Jesse. There's still people coming in, so if you just would hang on for another 5 minutes or so before we start. I'll go gather up people from downstairs.
to stand. Yep, I got all that set up. Yeah, it's a little. I'll make it work. Yeah. It's basically just going to be me going like this, same time. And then if somehow the slide's not lining up for some reason, signal.
Yeah, I'll just raise my hand.
Okay.
I'll follow you in the back. Okay, I'll raise my hand for you.
No, I'm going to use this. Oh, all right, everyone. I have one technical housekeeping problem I have to get. Okay. Did you find the person? Okay, thank you. Okay, just one quick, if somebody has a Buick SUV with the license plate LDA 2766, it's parked in the driveway and it's blocking Elliot Dalton from getting out. So anybody have that SUV? It's a Buick? Oh, there we go. Okay, we will wait for you to come back, or you can switch places. Okay. All right, Dan, I'm going to let you take it away.
All right. Thank you so much for coming, everyone. My name is Daniel Embry, and I'm the Executive Director of Kennett Collaborative, which is one of the hosts along with Kennett Community Grocer tonight. We are a nonprofit organization that provides quality programming and events and placemaking initiatives here in Kennett Square to help Kennett thrive. I have a couple thank yous just to kick us off. I want to thank the Presbyterian Church of Kennett Square for hosting us tonight and for running tech and just being overall wonderful, supportive collaborator here. I want to thank Edie, the president of the board of Kennett Community Grocer, and for, you have some fans.
They're my friends.
Fans and friends. Thank you for approaching me to collaborate on this. We're really excited to be presenting this to the community. I want to thank you for bringing John Steinman to town and to speak tonight. I want to thank Tom Sausen for introducing us and kicking this all off. So really excited tonight. A couple housekeeping items. If you're looking for the restrooms, they're through these doors here and to the left in the back. After we're done in here with the speaker series tonight, we'll go downstairs, and to go downstairs, you'll also go through those same doors over here to your right. I'm very sorry, we did have a Spanish translator who unfortunately had to, something happened where she had to back out at the very last minute. We are going to make a Spanish language translation of the transcript of tonight available, but I'm very sorry that we don't have live translation. We will be using the recording of the live stream tonight, though, to create a transcript so that that can be available, because we'd like for everyone to be able to hear what John has to say. There is a link to the video, to the live stream, through the Presbyterian Church's YouTube page and on the Evite to this event, but we'll also be making that video permanently available on the Kennett Community Grocer website. So you'll check that out. I hope you'll have an opportunity tonight to really learn about Kennett Community Grocer, and if this is something you want to be behind and be supportive of, I really hope that you'll consider joining tonight and being a part of that. There's also an opportunity to get involved with Kennett Collaborative. So we're the nonprofit organization that puts on the weekly farmers market that hopefully you're familiar with. If not, I hope you'll become familiar with. That's every Friday, year-round, all seasons at the Creamery. The hours during the spring and summer now are from 3 to 6, so those are extended hours there. All of the food is made and grown locally there. I really hope that you'll support the local food economy by shopping at the farmers market. And you can also help us support financially the farmers market and all of the other programming we do in town, such as Third Thursdays on State Street during the spring and summer, kicking off here in May, where we close down State Street and you can dine outside and enjoy the town. Other events like the Memorial Day Parade, light up the square at the holiday times, the Christmas decorations that you see along State Street, Holiday Village Market at the Creamery, and so many other events. You can support those by becoming a collaborator. And if you're interested in that, that's a donation to the nonprofit organization. We've got a table in the back there, and we'll also be downstairs talking about that. So again, hope you'll continue supporting all of the things, wonderful things going on in Kennett, including Kennett Community Grocer. So I'm going to pass the mic here to Edie.
You might not see me in the back. So I thought, plus I don't get a chance to stand at a podium like this very often. So this is exciting. Hello everyone, good evening. It's a little toasty in here. You can fan yourself if you need to, or grab a hymnal or something and fan yourself. It's a little toasty. But we'll make up for it by having a really interesting evening. On behalf of the Kennett Community Grocer Board, I want to welcome you here. And I also want to say we have absolutely wonderful volunteers for Kennett Community Grocer, and they are all about here this evening to help you out. I want to say a big, heartfelt thank you to them. Mostly I want to say thank you also for you to come here tonight. Tonight we are a community. That's what we're all about, being a community, collaborating, getting together, feeling like we belong with one another. And I know most of you from either you're my personal friends or you are people that I have talked to at the tables at the farmers market. So I really feel like I am in a community of friends tonight. Thanks, Dan. He was very nice, but he actually did not say that Tom Sawson and I didn't really give him an opportunity to say no to collaborating on this event. Tom and I burst into his office a couple of months ago and said, we need to have this event with John Steinman, and you're going to collaborate with us. So thank you, and thanks to Kelly Prater, Tara Smith, and Ross Fenton for helping us with all the enormous amount of work that went into the publicity to bring this to the Presbyterian Church. I want to thank John Billette and Darcy and Liz Lawson for being wonderful to host us here at this church. I also want to give a very big shout out to our farmers and vendors that are here tonight to give you a little bit of information about their farms. We are on a mission together to change the food ecosystem here, to support our local farmers. We are doing that in a very mini way by the co-op box, the KCG co-op box that we're selling once a month from our website. And some of the vendors that are offering products in that box are here with us tonight. We also they have been very generous, these same farmers and vendors, to donate products to us for our raffle baskets. And since there are not that many of you, and we have 4 big baskets, the odds of winning at the raffle are really good, probably like 4 to 1. And so please, if you take your tickets, we'll call those raffles at about 8:45. If you've come in late, we have a sign-in sheet at the back. I think Adam and Rachel, so Adam Peterson, Mitch and Rachel Warren are in the back, and Kim Eagle. They are doing a fabulous job in helping you to join tonight, if you'd like to join. And also, we are capturing information on all of you who have come. Did I say that right, Adam?
With the best intentions.
Okay. So anyway, they are back there. We also are offering, for those of you who sign up tonight, there are $20 off coupons to the KCG co-op box. So if you sign up tonight, you will get that coupon to have a discounted box. Last but not least, I want to tell you about us, all of us. But before I start that, are we ready with the buttons? Okay. We have a little thing for you tonight. If I would like to ask all the people who are member owners of the Kennett Community Grocer to please stand. Okay. Now we have people coming around to give you a button to wear. John is going to talk about being a food ambassador. And with your buttons, now you have become a food ambassador. So as a food ambassador, wear it on your shirt, on your purse, put it on your shopping bag. That way, people can say, oh, what's that all about? Why did you join? And then you can develop your own story about that. And we are hopefully, by the end of this evening, John will give you lots of good tips on how to tell that story. Because we are on the move, guys. Those of you who are member owners, we really are on the move. We have a lot to tell you about that tonight. Our plan is we are at 303 now, 303 member owners. I used to stand at the farmer's market when I was freezing my butt off or roasting to death, and people would say to me, when are you going to open? When is it going to be? And I would always say the same thing. When we get to about 300 members, then we'll be into the serious business part of opening the store. Okay, so we're here now. What are we going to do about that? We do want to, this year, in 2023, move to 500 member owners, because that gives us a better opportunity to have people who loan you money or want to give you money to open the store, because they see that you're really serious. So at 300, you're pretty serious. At 500, you're very serious. So you'll be seeing a lot of communication to get us to 500. Next, we have done a market sales force forecast feasibility study. The good news there is it was done by a preeminent expert in market analyses from a very good firm. And that market study tells us that we will be successful with a store here in the Kennett area. Somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 square feet, we will have successful sales and be able to support a store. That's a very important study to have done because any business person will tell you that's, step one. Step two is we need to get a site. So we are close to engaging with a realtor to kind of help us on that journey. The journey is going to look for a site. Anybody has a building that they want to lease to us that meets this criteria, we're looking for somewhere in the neighborhood of 6,000 square feet, somewhere between New Garden and East Marlborough Township going to Longwood, kind of around, Baltimore Pike area. That's accessible, like an accessible store, maybe you can walk to it, but also we need to have good parking and good ingress and egress to bring all those SUVs in to collect all those groceries. So we have a big mission for site selection. Once site selection is done, we will begin our capital campaign to raise the initial monies to get a loan and to get going. We have Tom Towson is back there. He's our chair of our business advisory committee. We have Elliot is on the committee. Lindsay Cook is here. We've got some great teams going, some great volunteer teams. And everybody is very busy. We're very serious about pushing this along. So I'm going to be quiet now very soon. So that's where we are. Next, I'd like to move now to why you came tonight to hear John Steinman. I will tell you that John and I spent a lovely afternoon tripping through the tulips at Longwood Gardens, and he was very impressed with Longwood Gardens. But I met John, I think it was almost 3 years ago now. I started my volunteer work with Kennett Community Grocer by starting a book club at the library. And for that book club, we read his book, Grocery Story. There are copies of the book for sale downstairs, and John will sign it. It's a wonderful book. Our book club read it, and Chris is sitting there nodding her head because she was at book club. And I asked John, I wrote to John and asked him if he would come to our book club night, and he did. So we had a wonderful Zoom call with him. So that was my first introduction. He is a fantastic speaker. He is the most knowledgeable person I know in food co-ops across the country and in Canada, if not the world. And he is going to tell you why it is important to start a food co-op here in the Kennett area. So, John.
Thank you, Edie. And is this working okay? Can everyone hear me okay? Great. Well, I was just, as I listened to the introduction there, I was reflecting on how many startups I've been hosted by. And I'm pretty sure it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 or 35 of the startups across the US have hosted me, mostly in person, some virtually. And that's over the past 4 years or so. And that's about half of the most active startups have hosted me. And as I was listening to just some of the language and enthusiasm that Edie was sharing there, I really was reflecting in that moment on how I've heard that same momentum and enthusiasm all of those 30 plus times with all of these other startups. And it was then I already knew this, but it really demonstrated to me in that moment that this is a part of a movement, that if there are these exact same events and groups forming for this reason, to build a grocery store in a community and have the community build it, you are a part of a very important movement. It might not seem like a large movement with maybe right now about 80 groups trying to form grocery stores, but it is definitely a movement that's shared across the country. I also just want to share a little bit too about this tour I'm on. So this is the fourth talk I've given now in the past week. I started off in California, gave a talk to a co-op that's trying to form in South Los Angeles in an area without any grocery stores. And I was hosted at a 1970s era co-op where the event was. I then went off to a music festival and gave a talk about food co-ops, which was an effort of mine to reach out to a different demographic, in this case a lot of younger people who are at a festival that's not just about listening to music, but had workshops and lots of yoga, and it just seemed like an opportune time to demonstrate what it might be to empower yourself to start a grocery store or be part of a co-op. Yesterday I was off in Westchester, which I didn't realize is as close as it is to here. So pretty amazing that there's two similar efforts happening so close to each other. And then on Saturday I'm off to Bethlehem, where there is a co-op that is a little further ahead than you and had broken ground last year and is hoping to move into their store in January. So this has been the tour that I've been on. And I was also just laughing too during the introduction, remembering a moment when I was in California of sending a text to my wife back in British Columbia where I live. And I was telling her about this amazing privately owned grocery store that I walked into, and I'm geeking out because I'm a grocery store nerd, telling her through text how amazing this grocery store was, and she writes back, she's like, "It's so cute how into grocery stores you are." And I laughed because it is kind of funny. And I replied to her with, it's more accurate to describe that my interest in grocery stores isn't so much my interest in grocery stores, it's my interest in food and good food. And it was that started my journey into becoming as much of a grocery store food co-op nerd as I am, and eventually writing a book about it and traveling a lot and talking about it as I'm doing here. So to give a bit of an outline as to what my intention is of this talk, there's really three areas that this talk is kind of split up into, and there's a bit of overlap. And the first is, why is what you're doing so important? Why is building a community grocery store so important? I'm sure you each have your own reasons, especially those of you who are already members. I also want to share a little bit about what a food co-op is, and what it isn't, because I know some of you are not yet members and are probably curious as to what the Kennett Collaborative or Kennett Community Grocer is all about. And then I want to speak as well on what was alluded to, which is this food co-op ambassador training, which is really in its kind of beta form. I haven't done it very often. It's not a very rigid training, doesn't have any handouts. It's mostly about how we tell the story about food co-ops. So of course, those of you who are members are already food co-op ambassadors, and I think it's so cool that you did these buttons. I didn't know these buttons were going to be made until I got here today, and that is actually amplifying my interest to maybe turn this into a much more formal food co-op ambassador training, to know that there is that kind of reception to this idea. And certainly, so those of you who are members, I think will become food co-op ambassadors if you aren't already. And those of you who are still curious about what your potential community-owned grocery store is, I'm really hoping after tonight you're going to choose to become a food co-op ambassador as well, which might begin with starting off as a member tonight, which, as I understand, is an opportunity tonight. Right? Yes. Yeah. So that's a little bit of the outline. And I do want to also introduce a little bit more about myself. If you read my bio, you'd know I'm the author of a book about food co-ops, Grocery Story. I was once a board director of a 1970s era food co-op where I live. That's my more recent work. I educate food co-ops. I offer sessions with boards of directors and staff, and I do public events like this. I've done quite a few other things that I'll get to in my slides. And previous to that, I hosted a radio show all about the food system. So I for 5 years, dove really deep into where our food's coming from, looked at everything from industrial agriculture to seafood to farm salmon, genetically engineered foods. I explored everything. And then I also explored all the ways people are reconstructing food systems locally, regionally, globally. And then that turned into a television series. And that's generally what you're going to read in my bio. There are a few things, though, that I do that I wouldn't have wanted to overwhelm Edie or whoever was doing the social media as to what else I do with my life and what else I'm involved in. So I just want to share a few things. I am an owner in a bank. So there's a small bank in Nelson that I'm an owner of. And we have $315 million in assets and $300 million in customer deposits. I also own 25 vehicles. Some of those are electric vehicles, SUVs, pickup trucks. There's a handicap access van. And we also have a low-speed electric vehicle that's for use only within city limits. You can't take it on highways. So 25 vehicles. I'm an owner in a commercial grain mill. So this is a mill that's available in Nelson, and people are able to come and use this grain mill and mill grains from local farms. I'm also an owner in a $3.7 billion outdoor apparel store that has 165 locations across the United States. And I'm also an owner in a 21,000 square foot grocery store that has 150 staff, and we do $26 million in sales. So as you might be starting to figure out, particularly with that outdoor apparel business that I mentioned, I'm not speaking of businesses I own on my own. I'm speaking of businesses that I own with thousands of other people. So that bank that I own is the Nelson and District Credit Union, which I own with 4,000 other people. The 25 vehicles I own with 325 other people, and that's the Kootenai Car Share Cooperative. So similar to the car shares you see operating mostly in cities, we built one ourselves in Nelson, and we collectively own those 25 vehicles, which are spread out into smaller communities in the region as well. The commercial grain mill that I own with 30 other people, and each owner has a set of keys to open where we have our mill stored in a heritage building in Nelson, and people can mill their own grains in this mill. And as you also probably gathered, that $3.7 billion outdoor apparel business I own is REI. Who here is an owner of REI? So yeah, we own this business together. And the grocery store I own is the Kootenai Co-op, which I'll be talking a little bit about in my talk here. And we're a almost 50-year-old food co-op. And I own that grocery store with 16,000 other people, which is pretty surprising because the city I live in, which is Nelson, British Columbia, has only 10,500 people, and we have 16,000 owners. So it's a pretty remarkable story. And in even fuller transparency, you might have thought, wow, who's this guy who owns all these businesses, a bank, 25 vehicles? The truth is, I've only earned, from all these investments and all these businesses I own, I've only earned $9.25 if you're trying to look at any sort of financial return. The $9.25 came from my grocery store this year as a percentage of the store's profits, which is based on how much I purchased through the year with my member number. So we're not talking about a retirement savings plan with my ownership. And so I introduced myself in this way for a few reasons. One is to really illustrate the power of story. And it's funny because this is the title of this section of my talk, the power of story. And when we walked into Longwood Gardens today, the first sign I saw as we turned off to the right, coming into the entrance, was this little sign that said the power of story. And it was one of these QR codes that you can scan so you can be taken on, I think, a bit of a tour of Longwood Gardens. And that was the title, the power of story. So it was a good sign, not the physical, tangible sign. And so I use this as a way to describe the power of story because I took what often is not described in that way and I described it just a little bit differently. For example, if you're a member of REI, that's often the way you might describe your relationship to it, even if you even remember that it's a co-op, which oftentimes people forget. So it's common to say I'm a member of a credit union, I'm a member of REI, but starting to change the language and telling a bit of a story of being an owner of it, as I see it, the power of story helps form meaning. And because story is often a bit of a why and a how that gets attached to what you're speaking of. And so the power of story really is what forms meaning. And so I know for myself, because those are the stories I tell myself when I use any of the vehicles in the car share co-op or I walk into my cooperative grocery store, because I'm telling myself that story that I am an owner, these businesses and services are filled with a sense of meaning when I walk into them because they're a part of my experience. They're not something that's separate from me. And so I just want us to open up with that, because that's a big part of the storytelling that I'm hoping with some of what I want to share tonight you'll be able to walk away with. That storytelling, has that power to form meaning, and it has the power to also shift the paradigm of something we might be used to, which in this case would be our relationship to grocery stores, which I'm speaking of. So I want to just invite you to reflect. Oh, not on that little boy. I want you to reflect on how filled with meaning your experience is walking into these grocery stores. I'm sure you've been into probably all of these. These are, as I understand it, many of the grocery stores in this area. And I want to invite you to, imagine how filled with meaning is your experience. And before I wrote my book, I came to believe that most of us, when we walk into grocery stores like this, are having a much more transactional relationship than any experience that's filled with meaning. It's much more, we walk in, we buy food. And so if we were to imagine that all of our experiences, like walking into grocery stores, have stories attached to them, I don't believe there's much of a story attached to the experience of walking into a grocery store. If there is a story, the story is that this is a business I buy food in, or this is a business that sells food. And that's the extent, really, I think, of the story that most people are experiencing when walking into these grocery stores. There is, however, a story we've inherited. And this is how I inherited a grocery story, in the back of a shopping cart like this. For me, though, it wasn't Lay's potato chips, it was Oreo cookies that my mother would pull off the shelf and feed me. So no doubt we inherit a story, we inherit an experience of going to a grocery store. And there's also a story that has been told and continues to be told by the industry. So grocery stores, certainly stories like this from the 1950s, were communicating a specific story of success, of confidence. Shopping at a grocery store is evolution from how things used to be. There was a time before grocery stores, and in order for them to form and establish themselves in the culture, in the society, a story had to be told. So you can see here on the sign, shop with confidence. Very proud family. So there was an effort for some stories to be told, and again, these are some of the stories we've inherited. Efforts like A&P, the largest of the grocers, who by the late 1920s had 16,000 stores. They were the first to launch a private label, and Page Foods. And you can see here, they're telling a story that if you're buying one of our private labels, you're a pretty smart, intelligent person. A mighty smart family lives here. So again, starting to weave an experience of what it means to shop at a grocery store. Kraft dinner, this was the beginning of convenience foods, food you could just heat up at home, add water. And this was a story that started to be told that this is an idea for a busy day. Stop toiling in the kitchen and making food. You can simply heat up food. And certainly this was a benefit to a lot of people, but again, there was a story being told to make that become a norm. The low-priced food culture that exists today, the one that has really dominated the industrial global food system, it began with stories, and grocery stores were really instrumental in telling those stories, that when you shop at our grocery store, you're going to save money. And of course, that's some of the stories we still see today. Here's a really interesting one that A&P told. Stop spending so much time in your garden. The garden is the produce department at our grocery store. This is your early spring garden. And in Canada, our largest grocer is Loblaws. They have about 30% of the market. And I think part of what gave them the power they have today was by telling stories like developing in the 1950s a board game called the Loblaws Checkout Game. So these are just some of the stories that have been told, which I think has formed into the grocery stores we see today. Now, what I've looked at in my work and what led me to write my book was to look at, over time, historically, how have we as people, as eaters, how have we counterbalanced the story, the narrative of grocery stores in our lives? How have we counterbalanced it? And so I started to look at, areas. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm changing all these slides on my screen and not up here. This is the first time I've had to control two different slides. So there's the Kraft dinner one. the low prices. How come no one told me that the slides weren't up here? This is the early spring garden and the Loblaws checkout game. You're all so polite. So historically, when you look at areas of our life that are of significant value, whether it be something cultural, economic, environmental, social, there has often been a counterbalance to the narrative and the stories that are being told by government and industry. So in the case of the introduction of agricultural pesticides, there was the most famous book, Silent Spring, which counterbalanced the narrative of DDT is good for me, right? And the same thing with the advent of the Industrial Revolution and the market economy. There was a time before all of that. And one person who really looked at the origins of the Industrial Revolution and how it was shaping society was Karl Polanyi, who wrote an amazing book, The Great Transformation, in 1944. When it came to the industrialization of the food system and the industrialization of meat production, you had Francis Moore Lappé write Diet for a Small Planet, which counterbalanced the narrative of how food was being produced. So you had all these amazing thinkers and artists and creative people who would counterbalance the stories through books. And so when I came out of my time as a journalist with radio, looking at the food system and eventually in television, I started to look at, well, who was counterbalancing the story of grocery stores? Considering most of us, if we're lucky, are shopping and accessing most of our food from grocery stores, this institution that has formed over about 125 years of history, who was, on behalf of us as eaters, writing the book to counterbalance either the story or the lack of story? Who was going to write the story? So I looked, and this is all I found. Prior to my book in 2019, there was this amazing book, The Great A&P, written in 2011. No other books could I find ever written about the grocery store industry. It really evolved on its own, and we as eaters have become passive participants in those stories. Which, when I visit with startups, I'm often asked, why is it so hard to kind of build a grocery store? It just seems like such an easy sell to create a grocery store that we own. And I think one of the biggest challenges is that we haven't been engaged in this storytelling. We've simply just accepted the grocery stores that operate in our communities. And it's that entrenched, 125 years of evolution. So these are the only 4 books that I know of that have been written in North America about grocery stores. There's a few good ones from the UK. So like I say, when it comes to the stories of our relationship to these grocery stores, I think we have been passive participants in the storytelling. Oh, thank you. So what does it look like to become an active participant? What does it look like when we start to tell a different story about grocery stores? And so I want to share some of the stories I tell myself. These are the stories I really built my book around. So one of the stories I tell is that grocery stores are the most powerful institutions shaping human health, more powerful than the healthcare system. And that idea that food is our medicine is really the foundation of this story. But no doubt, when we look at diabetes, obesity, heart disease, mental wellness, all of that can be traced to the food that we're eating. Maybe not entirely, but it's certainly a very considerable influence. And so this is why I've come to believe that because grocery stores are the primary point of convergence where we as eaters meet the food system, these are the most powerful institutions shaping human health. And that starts to change my experience of walking into a grocery store when I realize that and when I believe that, which I believe to be true. Another story I tell is that grocery stores are the most influential institutions shaping our planet, our environment, and our climate. We know that upwards of 35% of greenhouse gas emissions come out of the food system. We know that weather patterns and climate is changing. The food system is certainly responsible. When you're up in an airplane, of course, not only are we contributing to that changing climate, But when you look out the window, you can see, of course, that food is shaping the landscape. It's shaping the planet. Even just driving around all the farms around here, food shapes the planet. And so again, when the grocery store is that primary point of convergence, these are, I believe, the most powerful institutions shaping the planet. Grocery stores are either agents of economic extraction or engines of community economic development. And so the dominant system has grocery stores operating in communities, extracting wealth out of those communities and sending them back to wherever those head offices are. If it's Giant, it's owned by a company in the Netherlands, Walmart, a company in Arkansas. Or they're engines of community economic development. They take the wealth from the community and recirculate it in the community. So that's a powerful role. We also know, just coming back onto, or coming to this economic piece, we know that when it came to 3 years ago, keeping businesses open that were the most important businesses to our lives, what was one of the businesses that remained open? But grocery stores. And partly because we are frequenting these businesses all the time. So that economic impact is considerable. And lastly, grocery stores are the most influential institutions shaping the food system. And so one of the reasons I believe that is illustrated through this image. And this is an image I have in my book, and it helps describe how there are 500 million people on the planet producing food, 8 billion people eating food, and in order for all that food to get from where it's produced to where it's consumed, it goes through a series of bottlenecks. So the first would be the agricultural commodity traders, companies like Cargill, for example, the food processors and manufacturers, which would be the Nestle's of the world, the PepsiCo, Unilevers. There'd be distributors as well, which is not on here. And then you have the retailers. And what those numbers indicate is generally how many companies dominate those bottlenecks. So in Canada, that's a very accurate number. We have 5 companies that control over 80% of all of the grocery dollars in Canada. So another way to look at that role that these grocers have is as gatekeepers. They pretty much are determining which foods make it to market and which don't. And because they have that power, as I see it, they are the most powerful institutions shaping the food system. And what gets me excited about that bottleneck is that that's the one we have control over. So there is an opportunity for us to go and look at that bottleneck and say, how can we help open up that bottleneck and allow for more foods that are special and unique to us and the foods that we want? How can we use our power to open up that bottleneck and have more food flow through? So we get to determine which foods make it to market and which don't. And so some of the language I was using too, that primary point of convergence, that's another story that I think is really important, is that this is the place that we have the power to change the food system, the grocery store. Yes, we can change the food system at farmers markets. Yes, we can change the food system at CSAs. All of it's part of an ecosystem that I'll speak of in a moment. But by and large, 365 days of the year, this is where most of us are accessing most of our food. So another thing I say in my book is that, it's the title of one of the chapters in my book, is that grocery stores are the food system's control center. So back when I was a teenager, I had a graphic design business. So my skills are a little rudimentary. But I took NASA's mission control here and just added all the grocery stores. And this is how I imagine the grocery stores changing the food system. You're supposed to say, oh, these are great graphics, John. And again, by having this image, which to me is just another storytelling using images, when I walk into these grocery stores, again, I'm having this image of the power of these stores. So I don't walk into grocery stores anymore and just see them as a business selling food. I see them as powerful as this. Again, with these stories. And of course, with these stories, my experience in grocery stores have become a lot more meaningful, and I hope they can do that for you as well. And these aren't fairy tales. This is based on real world impacts. If anything, the fairy tale is not telling the story. or inheriting just the story that we've been told. So I want to give just two quick examples of communities who have become active participants in telling their story, telling a new grocery story. So the first here is Dayton, Ohio. And oftentimes co-ops form in periods of discomfort, when a group of people are struggling, when there's an injustice, when the free markets failed them. Historically, over the past couple hundred years, that's how co-ops form. So in this case, this area of Dayton, Ohio was placed into a pretty uncomfortable position when this Kroger in 2008 closed its doors. Oh, yeah, thank you. There it is. This is a new skill I have to work on here. And so that was the first of actually a few different grocery stores that closed in Dayton. And just to give you a sense of the area that this affected, so that Kroger was down in the bottom left of this trade area. So there are 22,000 people in this area, 5,300 children, median income with 28,500, 3/4 African American, 33% of households had received SNAP in the past 12 months. So this was a designated food desert, according to the USDA. These two green dots are convenience stores that had maybe a little more than just your typical convenience store. And the biggest grocery stores are the ones in blue, all in that area outside. So for anybody who did not have a car, which of course would be many in an area with this median income, it would take on city transit 1 hour each way to get from where that Kroger used to be to the other Kroger at the top left there. And of course, on a bus, you can't take that many groceries. It's as much as you can carry. So the community came together rather than ask for anyone else to do something about it. They came together just like your co-op would have come together in a meeting. And all co-ops have started with either one person or a small group of people coming together. So in 2015, this group came together, formed a co-op, a worker owner and consumer owner co-op. They used both models, a hybrid. And two years ago, as of next month, Gem City Market opened its doors. So they started with 3,000 owners, raised $5 million, and built a grocery store in an area that did not have one prior. And it made, of course, the headline news in Dayton, Ohio. This is a big deal because in Dayton, this isn't the only designated food desert in the city. And what this co-op, thank you, chose to do, there it is, Gem City Market. What this co-op chose to also have is a teaching kitchen, because it's not as simple to just open a grocery store and hope all of a sudden everyone comes and shops there. There's also a need in many areas that are food deserts for literacy and kitchen literacy and support as well. And there's also a health clinic in this Gem City Market. Another story in Buffalo, New York. This is in the east side of Buffalo, and this building here was built in 1939, and it is labeled as the birthplace of segregation in Buffalo. And the reason being, it was the first public housing built for black residents in Buffalo. And similar to many cities across the US, as black residents moved in, white residents left, and with it took businesses like grocery stores, and it was much more difficult for black residents to be able to take out loans, to get loans from banks, get insurance for their businesses. And fast forward to more recently, this area had been a food desert for many years. The community lobbied this one company, Tops, out of eastern New York State, to open a location, and this was the only grocery store for all of the Buffalo's east side. But the products on the shelf did not really speak to the neighborhood. And so a group came together, the African Heritage Food Co-op, and formed this first store in Niagara Falls, which was really more just a pickup location to help build momentum. They engaged in community cleanup events, community gardens, mobile markets. They would distribute food. And they started to imagine opening a second location in Buffalo, and they found a heritage building that was slated for demolition. And this is only a few blocks away from that Tops grocery store. And this is what their renderings look like today. So there are communities all across the United States that are looking to this food co-op model to serve the failure of the market, to serve their interests and their needs. And it's often believed that co-ops are synonymous with natural and organic foods, and that's not the case. And these two examples really demonstrate that. Even though the African Heritage Food Co-op, this particular one, is very interested in local and organic as well, foods. This was what they did this year. They worked with a health agency, a local bank, and raised enough money to buy this truck so that they could bring food out to all of their members because they don't yet have a store. So this is some of the potential of coming together and forming a food co-op. And all of these stories have become that much more important because over these past 3 years, there has been a spotlight on grocery unlike ever before. You know, when I was writing my book, I was really hoping that this was going to open up people's eyes to grocery stores. And then 3 years ago, it just happened on its own, where we started to see without choice how important these institutions are when we walked into grocery stores and didn't find any food. And it created, I believe, a sense of vulnerability, whether consciously or not. We've started to see, I think, just how risky it is to rely so much on these businesses operating in our communities. And if it wasn't for panic buying, it was supply chain challenges that led to many instances of empty grocery store shelves. We've also been paying more attention to grocery stores than ever before because of the disparity we recognize between what frontline workers are being paid and what executives in these companies are being paid. This has been headline news in Canada. We've had Canada's CEOs of the largest grocery stores summoned to Ottawa to testify in front of elected officials. Here's just some of the headlines too in Canada. And this is starting to bring light to the relationship between the grocers and their suppliers, who have long had a very dominant power over relationship. And as I'm writing my book, I feel like I'm an investigative journalist exposing some of these practices, and now some of this is headline news. I mean, here's just some of the examples. These are all really titles in a section of my book about the fees that the big grocers charge to suppliers to access the shelves, the plagiarizing of private labels, the fines that grocers charge their suppliers, late payments. Again, this is all now coming to light. And this is also what happened in Canada, where Frito-Lay, owned by PepsiCo, cut off the supply to Canada's largest grocer over a price dispute. So rather than bow down to Loblaw's pressure, Frito-Lay simply said, yeah, we're going to stop delivering our product. And so for a month, you would go into Loblaw grocery stores across Canada and there'd be empty shelves of Frito-Lay potato chips. So this is all just in the past few years. This has never before been seen in any recent history. And then, of course, there's the soaring food prices. And this, too, has been headline news in Canada, as I know it is here in the United States. And all of a sudden, you know, what's being attached to this is market concentration, the oligopoly that dominates Canada's grocery market. So this is an opportunity for startups that are already formed, like yours, to really start to speak to this interest and awareness in the power of grocery stores. And here's just a few examples in the United States of just some of the headlines too. Nonprofits putting out reports like this one here on the left, or in some cases in the US Senate, people in the grocery industry testifying. For example, these retailers use their control over the market to advantage themselves at the expense of everyone else. They dictate terms and conditions to suppliers. Some even pressure suppliers not to sell certain products to independents. And because of their position as gatekeepers, there's that language, to so many shoppers, suppliers have no choice but to acquiesce. And as Amy Klobuchar says, the takeaway message should be clear. A concentrated food supply chain is a vulnerable food supply chain. So this is being talked about for the first time in a long time. Most recently, here was the news last year, the proposed merger of two of the largest grocers, Albertsons and Kroger, which would, if approved, make all of these banners under one company. So there's a story that's also told that we've inherited, that in order to hold grocery stores accountable, we have a government to do that. And there's another story as well, which is that grocery stores are privately owned businesses. This is another story that we've inherited. And so I want to just offer a little bit of a history lesson here. My book is the extended version of what happened the first time government tried to regulate grocery. Because in the early days of the A&Ps, Safeway, Kroger, and Canada, and Loblaws, there was a fierceness to the resistance to the rise of these chains that we haven't seen before in any recent history. So, like I say, A&P grew to have 16,000 stores by the late 1920s. To give you a sense of how quickly the chain store grocers came to be, this is a really telling chart here. So in 1919, the top 5 grocers held over 4% of the market. In just 12 years' time, they came to control 29% of the market. So that's almost the same pace that we've seen probably social media become as powerful as it is today. And certainly because we are witnessing that, we can see the impacts, hopefully, some of us, on how powerful and how impactful, I should say, social media is on our lives. This is what people were seeing in the early 20th century. The rise of the chain grocer impacted Main Street America. It impacted the independent grocers. It impacted the independent bakers, the produce suppliers, the farmers. Everyone felt the impact of this. And that impact was responded to by the highest levels of government. And I'll just share a couple of sentiments. Louisiana Governor Huey Long said, "I would rather have thieves and gangsters than chain stores in Louisiana." And here's a headline from 100 years ago in the New York Times. "Huge corporations serving the nation through countrywide chains are displacing the neighborhood store." So you could write that headline today. So this was happening 100 years ago. This is late 1930s. About 39 states had implemented taxes on chain stores. Pennsylvania had one of the most onerous of any of the taxes. So much so that A&P closed stores here in Pennsylvania because of that. Municipalities also had their own chain store taxes and restrictions. So there was a fierceness to that resistance that some have called the Second American Revolution. And it wasn't just applied to grocery stores, it was applied to the rise of big business. And what compelled some of the co-op formation that we still have around a little bit today can find its history back in the Depression era, when people were really pushed into periods of discomfort and struggle. And one of the responses the government took was to introduce a number of what were called then fair trade laws. And what came out of those fair trade laws was requiring grocers to draw up codes of fair competition. And if you were compliant, you would put this NRA code up into your window to indicate to consumers that you are complying with these fair trade rules. So this was the last time when there was an effort to regulate and control grocery stores. And even though this code only lasted for a couple of years, I just want to offer an example as to how industry responded. Because there is talk today, certainly in Canada, of implementing something similar to this. So one of the results of it was industry realizing we need to come together so that we can be more powerful in the eyes of government. And that was the beginning of the first trade associations for grocery stores. So one of them was the National Association of Food Chains. Another was the Supermarket Institute, which a few decades later formed or combined to become the Food Industry Association, FMI, who also formed the SQF, the Safe Quality Food Institute. The Food Industry Association, FMI, is the most powerful lobby group for the grocery industry today. They pretty much are a private economic government. And so this is what happens when we try to regulate industry. Industry responds in ways like this. And so I just offer it as an example of, well, what if we were to try to do that again? What if government was to try to hold grocery stores accountable again? And through the 1950s and 1960s, there was a protection of competition in the marketplace. And it lasted well into the early 1980s. And it was the Reagan administration that dismantled a lot of that protection, antitrust regulations, antitrust enforcement. And it led to the rise of grocery dominance we see today. And so this is what it looks like in the US. You have 5 companies who dominate 67% of the market. In Canada, 5 companies with over 80% of the market. The top 2 alone with over half of the market. And when we start to look at communities like some of these smaller communities with 15,000, 20,000, 25,000, we have Walmart, in this case, having pretty much complete dominance over the grocery market. I know of a startup in Whitewater, Wisconsin, that is 15,000 people in the community. There is 1 grocery store, and that's Walmart. So I just share some of that history because with these stories of the impact of grocery stores on human health, the environment, the economy, the food system, I've asked myself, can we rely on government to hold our grocery stores accountable as far as their impacts in these 4 key areas? And historically, we've seen that it had been possible, and I've come to believe that I don't think it's possible anymore because of how powerful grocers have become. So here was a headline in November of last year in Canada, because we're starting to repeat history again. Food industry leaders close to finalizing a grocery code of conduct. And this is the conversations happening in Canada. We need to regulate these grocers. We need to figure out how to hold them accountable. And I would invite anyone to remember the last time this tried to happen and what the response was. Here was an effort by Long Beach, California's municipality during the pandemic to demand that grocers pay workers $4 an hour more. The result was Kroger closing 2 of the locations in Long Beach, and those grocery stores haven't reopened. So these efforts of using government to hold grocery stores accountable is not necessarily the route that's going to hold grocery stores accountable. And accountability is a big part about what makes a co-op important. Before I get into talking more about co-ops, I want to share just one alternative that many people have turned to. Rather than supporting chain grocers, many people have turned to independent grocers. There are many amazing, conscientious, privately owned businesses out there. And there have always been, and there continues to be. But there's a risk to the private ownership model, and I'll use this as an example. So Capers Markets was the first natural foods chain in Western Canada that opened in the 1980s. And it lasted well through into the early 2000s as Capers Markets. They had 3 locations, like you see here. But because it was privately owned, it was open to the market economy, open to speculation. And sure enough, Alfalfa's out of Colorado purchased Capers Markets. And then Alfalfa was purchased by Wild Oats. And then Wild Oats was purchased by Whole Foods. And Whole Foods was purchased by Amazon. And so here was a business that many people actually confused with a food co-op because it had very similar values to the food co-ops we see open today. It cared about natural and organic foods, it supported local suppliers, it treated their staff really well. It was a very community-oriented grocery store. 3 locations, it was hard not to be. But all of the values that were built into this business by the owners, all of the values that people invested in as customers, all of those relationships that the suppliers built, all of that was handed over to these new parent companies and these new companies that acquired the business. And in many cases, as many people tell stories of Whole Foods, the culture has changed. I met a 25-year veteran of a large natural foods chain not that long ago who was let go because they were trying to preserve those original values of that company. So a lot changes when these companies acquire independent grocers. So this is not a very secure model. Here's what these stores look like today. They've all, of course, been relabeled as Whole Foods Markets. And another piece, too, just to bring in this accountability piece, is it doesn't matter if it's a chain store or an independent, privately owned business. If either the independent owner or the chain store wants to close that store, they don't have to go and consult the community that relies on it. So there's 2 grocery stores, as I understand it, here in Kennett Square. Either of them could choose to close. I'm not believing they will, but if they were, they wouldn't have to come and consult the community about it. They could just simply close that store, despite how important they are to our communities. And that would be the same with any independent, privately owned grocer. And so to bring back this book, The Great Transformation from 1944, Karl Polanyi saw what we're seeing today. He saw this back then. And he wrote, to allow the market mechanism, the market economy, to be the sole director of the fate of human beings and their natural environment. Indeed, even of the amount and use of purchasing power would result in the demolition of society. So quite prophetic. And so this is why I have become a food co-op geek, because never before has a food co-op been sold to a private interest. No company has ever bought a food co-op. And the reason is because it's a cooperative, it is owned by its customers. So I'm one of 16,000 owners of my co-op. I paid, in my case, $50 because our share price has never changed over many decades. And I am now an owner, and I vote once a year for my board of directors. And as a co-op, this is just another classification for any business. And the reason why no co-op has ever sold to a private interest is because in order for it to sell, it wouldn't be the decision by an individual, it wouldn't be the decision by a board of directors, it would be the decision by the membership. And never before have the thousands of people that own a grocery store, a cooperative grocery store, have they ever voted to sell their grocery store to anyone else. So it is a very durable model to preserve a grocery store, and it's a durable model to preserve everything we invest into that grocery store, all those good values that we can put into it. And so when it comes to accountability, we as consumers, we get to hold our grocery store accountable. We don't have to ask anyone else to hold our grocery store accountable. We do that. And we do that because we vote for the board. We certainly have a stronger voice than anyone who's not an owner because we own the place. And so, yeah, this is one of the stories I tell. I own a grocery store with a bunch of my friends, similar to the story I opened up with. And the other important piece that's very different about a co-op than any other grocery store is how profits are used. So this is a great diagram from Middlebury, Vermont's co-op, where it shows how all the profits that get generated get returned either back into the business, which benefits everyone, or they get returned into the pockets of the members. So if there's excess profits, management and the board will decide to allocate some of that to the owners, and based on how much you purchased, you receive a percentage back. So that's basically like the grocery store saying to its customers, hey, we want to apologize. It looks like we've charged you too much this past year, and we'd like to give you a little back. So even though many food co-ops are for-profit businesses, they're effectively nonprofits in that all the profits stay in the community and come back into the business and back into the pockets of the customers. And these are democratic institutions. And some of the language I always use is this is a way for us to not just have democracy be the political process that we're used to, but we can democratize the economy, democratize the grocery stores, democratize the services and businesses that we're a part of, and that's the co-op model. This year was 17 people running for the board of directors at the Seward Co-op in Minneapolis. So I just want to share a few stories of other co-ops. There was that era of the Depression that birthed thousands of food co-ops. Some of them remain today. One of the closest of that era is in Swarthmore, which I know I'm not pronouncing properly. Was that? Oh yeah, good. Yeah, so I got to visit there in 2019. They can trace their history back to 1932, I believe, as a buying club. This is Co-op Food Stores in Hanover, New Hampshire, which came out of the Depression era. Dalhousie University professors got together and formed a food co-op during the Depression. And today, or this was 25 years ago now, they celebrate, or 25 years after they formed, they celebrated their 25th anniversary. That was 1961. And this is what it looks like today. They have 4 locations in Hanover, White River Junction, Vermont, Hanover, New Hampshire. And they also have a gas station that they own together and a service center. which is quite unique for a co-op in the United States. And this is the teaching kitchen in one of their stores. Beautiful teaching kitchen. So, co-ops are not just about selling food, they're also about education, literacy, training. And there's also an amazing history of black-led food co-ops as well. So I shared a couple examples that are more recent, but this one here is from the 1960s in Detroit, Michigan, the Black Star Market. And some of the language being used then, as you can see in the bottom window, is shop here for community control. And in their statement of purpose, they used language like economic autonomy, economic sovereignty. In the top left, that's a food co-op, a black-led food co-op in Chicago from the 1940s. So there were different periods as well of co-ops forming, not necessarily in waves. 1941 was the Putney Food Co-op. Food shortages, oil shortages led this community to organize and form a food co-op in 1941, and it's one of the most beautiful co-ops I've visited. Here's a few images of what it looks like inside. And this really is the community center for this community. All the events happening are posted on the bulletin board outside the Putney Food Co-op. And then there was the wave of food co-ops from the 1970s, which really are the dominant food co-ops today. So this here is the first on the right of PCC Co-op, which is the largest co-op now, 16 stores in the Seattle area. This was their first store on the right. You have Fort Collins, Colorado here on the bottom left, Seattle's Central Co-op in the middle on the left, and then Montauk Food Co-op, which was in Massachusetts. And what happened in the 1970s that caused a wave of co-ops to form was people were organizing around civil rights, women's rights, anti-war movement. You had fuel shortages caused by, or food shortages caused by the OPEC oil shocks. And then you also had people rising in interest in looking for organic foods, natural foods, vegetarian foods. And all of these forces came together to launch thousands of buying clubs across the country. And some of those buying clubs, which were very informal, became co-ops. And then eventually in the mid to late 70s, early 80s, they formed into stores. And the ones that formed into stores are the ones we see today that are the most powerful food co-ops. So again, it came in waves. And I want to just share a little story about my co-op, because my co-op is one of those co-ops from the 1970s. It was in 1975 that it formed. I moved to British Columbia from Ontario in 2006 and became a board director within a couple years of my co-op. I had no idea what a co-op was when I first got to Nelson, and immediately saw the influence that this grocery store was having. So to give you an idea of the size of this space, this was a 5,000 square foot store. We had 4 other large grocers owned by Canada's largest grocers operating in Nelson, and we were doing $6 million in sales out of this 5,000 square feet, which was one of the highest sales per square foot of any grocery store. So we were bursting at the seams, and we began imagining growing into a bigger store. And at the other end of our one Main Street, our town is 10,000 people, so it's got a similar size downtown to yours, there was this Extra Foods, which was a business run by Canada's largest grocer, Loblaw. Luckily for us, it took many years for us to find this location. Luckily for us, the building was not owned by Loblaw, it was owned by a local family, and Loblaw's lease was about to run out. Rather than renew with Canada's largest grocer, the owners sold the building and the land to us. We purchased it for a pretty amazing price and came up with a very ambitious vision. And this is the vision we came up with, which was a mixed-use development. It's not normal for co-ops to be a developer of a building like this, and I wouldn't recommend it. But this is an example of how many food co-ops are forming today. They're partnering with developers, partnering with other organizations to be an anchor tenant to a development like this. This has become really common, just not being the developer. So we proposed 44 residential units, a 21,000 square foot space that would become ours, and by the end of it all, we would simply just own our grocery store and everything else would be owned by others, including the condominiums. And we were successful in raising $1.8 million through a member loan campaign. We had 179 owners lend us $1.8 million, and that showed the credit unions, in our case, the financial institutions, that we were serious, and they also came in and paid for the rest of our development. This was the first construction crane ever put up in Nelson's history. So this was the front page news, as I imagine it would be here too if this went up. And this was a symbol of what community organizations and what a co-op and what in our case was an interest in, an interest in local food can build. You know, this is a symbol really of that. That's certainly how I saw it. And this is what our building looks like today. So no question, we had a lot of momentum behind us. 50 years of momentum, well, 50 years now, this time maybe 40 years of momentum. And so today we've become a $26 million business, growing from that $6 million. I should say in that previous location we were doing $14 million before we left. So we were really exploding in that space. And we now employ 150 people. We pay $5.4 million in wages. And I just want you to notice that I'm saying we. I don't work at the co-op. I'm not on the board of the co-op anymore. And I still use that language because this is the store I own. So again, this is all part of the storytelling. This is what our produce department looks like. We've chosen for our produce department to be 100% certified organic, but this is not synonymous with what a food co-op is. So I have images in one of the photo books I published that I have some copies downstairs of that show food co-ops that operate in areas without any grocery store having both conventional and organic options separated in the store. So co-ops are whatever the community wants them to be. If you want to be a niche local food market, you can be that. If you want to be a zero waste store, you can be that. If you want to serve multiple demographics or cultural groups in a community, you can be that. Grocery stores or food co-ops could be whatever the community wants them to be. And I just want to share another 1970s co-op. And these are examples of what co-ops can become. And what I believe is the startups of today are going to be able to accelerate to what co-ops like these are doing now much more quickly than it took the old 1970s co-ops to get to. And part of that is that there's now all of these best practices that are being developed by the experienced 1970s co-ops. So this is a co-op in Bozeman, Montana, which while I was there was building what you see on the right, this new addition to their store. They also have a second location. And in order to serve both locations, this is their second location downtown. In order to serve both locations, they built this incredible commissary kitchen in the back of their co-op. It's almost as big as the store. And so this is something that food co-ops get into. It's not something all food co-ops do, but it's certainly what makes a co-op different than any other grocery store is vertically integrating into the food system by producing food in the store. So all the prepared foods, the salads, the grab and go, all made in the store. And this is the largest warehouse this is just a sliver of the warehouse they've built. So back on this idea of supply chains that people are now paying more attention to, this is the efforts food co-ops are making to secure the supply chain locally in the store, in the building, by increasing their purchasing power, and this is what the Bozeman Food Co-op is doing. And this is the bakery inside the food co-op that's dedicated, a dedicated bakery just for the co-op. And in my co-op, we also have a kitchen that's not nearly as big. We have a smaller store, but everything you see here was made in our kitchen. So salad dressings, dips, pizzas that you can throw right in the oven, all the baked goods you see here on the left. And the reason I share this is because there's an importance that this image helps to communicate. So here on the left is a hummus that's made in our co-op. On the right is a hummus that's made in Vancouver, British Columbia, and Vancouver is 8 hours east of us. And when I walked by the shelf, this is what it looked like. And I noticed that probably what happened is something I'm sure we've all done at one point. You pick something up in one part of the store, notice a better option, and then you make an exchange, and rather than go back to where you got it, you just leave the product there. So this is, I'm pretty sure, what happened here. And maybe that's not what their reasoning was, but what was happening here by choosing to take the product made in the store is they were leaving more of their food dollar in our community. because they were paying for the worker in our kitchen to make that product. And so this is the power food co-ops can also have. It's not just about putting food on the shelf and selling it. There's a whole number of other ripple effects. And so this is an example from my website of my food co-op directory of how many food co-ops there are across the US. So right now there are 315 or so food co-op locations across the United States, soon to be 316 in Kennett Square. And so this is, why I believe this is a movement. And I'm inspired enough by this movement to not only have written a book, but I went off and bought a van and had it paid for by all the sponsors you see on the back of my van. I didn't realize I was going to look like a NASCAR driver. And I spent 6 months driving across the United States and Canada, 2 3-month periods, tracking over 22,000 miles, visited 125 food co-ops, 23 startups, and I certainly saw a lot. And I really wanted to make sure that anybody driving behind me on the road was at least going to be confronted with a question. And so I posed this question: who owns your grocery store? And purposefully I drove really slow so people would be stuck behind me. And so this is just a snapshot of all the co-ops I saw. And if you probably visited co-ops, as I know, there are many in Philadelphia, they all look different. Each store looks different. Each is an expression of the community. Co-ops really are an expression of a community. No one co-op looked alike. And then there is an entire movement of startups, as I mentioned. And this is just an example of where startups are concentrated. There's about 85 represented in this heat map. And you can see there's certain areas like the Northeast, where we are here. Chicago has quite a number of startups. So this is a new wave. There wasn't a lot of co-op development between the 1970s and the early 2000s, and then all of a sudden the interest in local food, certainly the disappearance of grocery stores has compelled people to build food co-ops. So your co-op is a part of this new wave. Does anyone know where this is? Any guesses? Yes, this is in Bethlehem. So this group, who had been working at it for 10 years, broke ground last year, and this is what their building looks like today. And so, as I mentioned, many startups are becoming anchor tenants to mixed-use developments. So they're hoping January of 2023. And they just officially announced, I kind of knew about this a couple weeks ago because I'm going there next week, or on Saturday, but they did just officially announce that they hired their first general manager just yesterday, or 2 days ago, which is a huge step. It relieves the board in a big way. But not right away, so don't get excited. And here's another great example of a startup. When I was in 2019 traveling, they were still in the startup phase, like you're in right now. And then 2 years ago, they opened their doors in the middle of the pandemic. And this is a small food co-op. This is one of the smaller startups that I know of. I think just a little over 3,000 square feet or so. Here's another image of the South Philly Food Co-op, and here's one half of the store. There's another half on the other side, as I recall. But really well designed, packed in a lot of food. If anyone's been, of course, to the Weaver's Way, the first location there, it is one of the most incredible small food co-op locations I've ever seen. So I showed you some really big co-ops, and there's also very small co-ops. So what these co-ops represent is something that Karl Polanyi mentions and coined. He coined this term, counter movements. When the free market fails a community, when it fails people, co-ops form. And so there have been waves of co-op development, as I mentioned, from the industrial era, from the Depression era, from the 1970s, the wave that's happening right now. And he calls them society's attempt to repair the disruption inflicted by the free market. And so what this image represents is a wildfire, and that first plant that where I live always grows to start to restore after that wildfire is fireweed. So that's kind of what co-ops are doing. They're helping restore the failures of the free market. And here's just a passage from my book. I wrote a book. I should at least read from my book. So this is just a section here that really reflects on the power of food co-ops. As globalization reduces individual and community autonomy to affect change, co-ops respond by opening up public spaces. In cities and towns of any size, when the places people shop, work, and entertain themselves are not rooted in the community, people can easily be left to feel an absence of autonomy and of hope for the future. The creative spirit is suppressed. This can lead to feelings of hopelessness and maybe even depression. Alternatively, when our cities and towns are filled with spaces that we can claim as our own, people can feel a sense of value and purpose, living from a place of freedom and possibility, and this is the human side of cooperatives. And another really great way to describe cooperatives is by this other Canadian co-op leader. Cooperatives are the radical center. Whereas capitalism and communism have a history of consolidating power into fewer and fewer hands, cooperatives spread power around. And the best way to imagine that within a co-op or a food co-op is that each shareholder, that you're all about to become if you're not already, has one vote. No one shareholder can have more votes than anyone else. So one vote per share. So that's the example of how power is spread around evenly. Here's another one from another Canadian co-op leader. What truly conditions how people live and what societies will become is the degree to which people can exercise control over their lives. Economics is central to this. So now is the quick recap. I'm going to try to be quick here. Because you are now all officially food co-op ambassadors. Well, not just yet. You're not finished the training. When anyone becomes a member tonight, they get a button, right? Yeah. And a coupon for a KCG co-op box. So this is a recap of some of what I've just shared. And as a food co-op ambassador, part of what you're doing is telling a story. And by telling that story, you're going to reframe how people see grocery stores. And that, to me, is the first most important piece. When someone asks what a food co-op is, it's easy to start to reply with, here's what a food co-op is. I've found the most valuable thing is to first establish, especially if you have the time, why is a grocery store important? And what is a grocery store? And what is the influence grocery stores have? Because first and foremost, co-ops or food co-ops are grocery stores. Yes, they're also cooperatives, but they're grocery stores. And so it's important, I think, to focus on that first piece. And one of the reasons to focus on that is because of what I shared earlier. There's more and more awareness about the power of grocery stores. Case in point, this was an article in the Globe and Mail in January of 2023, this year. This is Canada's most read newspaper. It's one of our national newspapers. This was an amazing piece about the rising price of groceries, written by one of the other authors that I have mentioned up there, here in the US. And it was an amazing piece, but it didn't leave any option for what we can do about rising prices. It wasn't a very empowering article. Very well written, but not empowering. And I thought this was an opportunity to offer this other way of seeing grocery stores, the food co-op way. And I wrote a letter to the editor, and I shared some of the language that I just shared with you today about how cooperatives are effectively nonprofit. Not only that, we get to see where our profits are going. There's transparency. We don't have to have an experience of mistrust when walking into a grocery store. And they printed it. And they printed it because, again, there's this opportunity and this opening for being able to respond to all of this conversation that's happening around grocery stores. And so that's your jobs. So as I mentioned, grocery stores are the most powerful institutions. This, I think, is the opening. This is the opening to talking about why a food co-op, what is a food co-op. Is first off, well, let's talk about why grocery stores have such an influence on human health, on the environment, on the economy, and on the food system. Remembering some of the language I mentioned as grocery stores as being gatekeepers, the food system's control center, remembering this image, the bottlenecks. And just in case you're not taking notes, I'm going to share these slides, and I know this is being recorded as well, so you can come back and look at all this. But if you have a pen and paper, you can be drawing this out on paper to describe, why do we want to get into that bottleneck and increase the space in that bottleneck. The food systems control center image. You can remember that as you're telling stories. And referring to co-ops as being a really durable model of ownership. That word durable, I find, is unique in helping describe, and it's very accurate to help describe what a food co-op is. Why is it durable? Well, remember this story about Capers Markets. I'm imagining there's some local stories here that are similar to this, and of course, use a local story, which is going to be much more relevant. Here's just a few others in Canada. All of these small chains, the ones on the bottom, were all acquired by Sobeys or Pattison Group, which is one of Canada's largest grocers. So there's many stories I can tell in Canada, and there's, I'm sure, many that you can tell here. And durability is also related to the future of that store. If we want to make sure that store stays in our community, it's the co-op model that can do that. So the future of a privately owned grocer is determined by a single individual, family, or company. At any point, the owner of that store can choose to close, to sell, to pass the business on to the next generation in the family who may not hold the same values as the previous generation, and before they do, they aren't required to consult the community that relies on them. Yep. My sharing of that story wasn't specific to this must be the only reason they closed those stores. It was more to share that here's an effort being made by government to try to restrain or control a grocer. And it was used as an example that, well, that didn't work. Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah. No. There's always more to the story. Absolutely. And this is another really important piece to just come back to: is never before has a food co-op been acquired by a chain grocer or a private company. And again, that durability is going to support your local farmers. I know your co-op's vision is to really support all your local food producers, and these are all people that supply my co-op. And so they rely on my co-op in a really big way because we're such a large purchaser of product. We purchase $3.5 million of local product every year, and local to us is actually local. It's not some of the larger versions of local that you might see at the bigger grocers. Another important distinction is that the head office of a food co-op, and this would go for any local business, the head office is inside the store. Why is that important? Well, the store employs more people. So all those jobs that would otherwise be in a head office, the CEO, the marketing manager, the HR manager, they're all in the store. So my co-op has about 40 people working in the offices at any one time, and it fills the store with more life and more people and more engagement. It becomes much more of a community center because of that, as mentioned here. And the most important decisions affecting the future of the store are being made by people who work in the store, shop in the store, and live in the community. So that's an important distinction. Again, there's the democratizing of the economy, and one of the ways I certainly talk about that is, well, we vote in elections so we can influence the institutions that have the greatest effect on our lives. How might we take that principle and apply it to the products and services we use? The banks, like the credit unions that we're members of, or the grocery stores. Democratizing the economy. Not everyone's a fan of democracy, so this might not be the way you want to talk about food co-ops. So I'm casting a wide net here. This doesn't, not each talking point here is going to work for everybody. But certainly one of the things with my co-op is when you're not happy with how our co-op is operating, you have the power to vote for the board of directors. And so often, the most people that are coming out to vote, just like in political elections, is when the co-op's made a decision that people don't like. And people come out and say, we want change, we want something different. And even the little requests that I make at my grocery store, something as simple as there's a product that's not on the shelf, can you get it for me? The co-op will go out of its way to get it for me. Why? Because I own the place. And I'm responded to. This was an event we held back in November, a town hall meeting. Who would have thought that a grocery store would hold a town hall? So this is an example of the democracy embedded within food co-ops. And what's also really valuable is to not just talk about owning the store, but owning the shelves. What I write about quite extensively in my book is about slotting fees, how grocers are not just in the business of selling food, they're in the business of selling shelf space. So that's what's known as slotting fees. So the checkout counter is the beachfront property. The eye-level shelves, or the penthouse condo, those are the most expensive shelves that are being sold to the food manufacturers to access. And to give an example of how that looks, you can take Amazon, which is a little more transparent about this. So when you go to Amazon and search for ketchup, this entire top row has all been paid for as a result, just like in Google, the sponsored results. The bottom is all sponsored, and the middle was more of an organic result. And this was supposed to be blown up, somehow it's not on this version. But there is a mention of which of these are sponsored. So there's a word underneath whichever one was paid for. We don't see that in the grocery store. So the placement of the food in the grocery store has been paid for, not all of it, some of it, but we don't get to see that. And so one of the values of owning our grocery store is we're also owning the shelves, and we determine what foods go where. If we want to support a healthier product or a local product, we can put that at eye level, and we get to make that decision. And by we, I mean the management of the store is making that decision. And when talking about the local economy, there's often the buy local mantra. And I just want to offer another way to talk about this. To make it personal starts to make it more real. And so this is just a few screenshots from a video I recently recorded where I talk about this $5 piece of carrot cake, a really amazing piece of carrot cake, from a local baker. And I'm talking about where my $5 goes. And so what I ended up doing for this video is I asked the baker, who's this person, Melissa Owen, who has a bakery in her house. She's a single mother who raises her kid and works in the same building. And I talk about where she spends her money. And so I happen to know now that she spends her money at one of our local coffee roasters. I'm also now supporting the people that work in that store. I know she goes and eats at Kurama Sushi, and now I know I'm supporting those people. My wife works part-time in this wellness clinic, and I happen to know Melissa, the owner of Epiphany Cakes, goes to this wellness clinic. So here's a great example of when I buy this cake, a portion of that $5 is coming back into my home. And so this is a more personal way to talk about the power of buying local. It doesn't have to, of course, just be at a food co-op. But this is what co-ops generally are doing, is caring for local products. So storytelling, again, is part of the process. And if people are into numbers, there's a lot of numbers out there in my book and out there available for how much money gets recirculated at a food co-op versus any other grocer. So my co-op and every co-op puts out there how much money gets recirculated back into the community. So yeah, we pay $3 million a year for local products, but we're also tracking the extra $1.2 million that's going to the lawyers, the website designers, the marketing companies that we're maybe using, the accountants in Nelson that we're using. All the money that we're keeping in our community we're tracking as well. And another really effective thing I've been doing for about 15 years now, and it seems to work, people afterwards are always like, well, that actually kind of changed my perspective on the food trucks that are coming into my community. So these Safeway trucks are coming in every day, delivering food to the Safeway in Nelson. Other grocers are coming in as well with their trucks, as I know they would here. And I don't look at these food trucks anymore in the same way. So Yes, these trucks are coming into the community filled with food. They're emptying food out into the back of these stores. And they're not leaving our community empty. I imagine them being filled up by us with our food dollars, filling them up with our community's wealth, and then watching that wealth leave our community. And so this is how I invite people to see these images of grocery coming into our communities in this way. And it really is about, do we have a leaky economy, or do we have an economy that helps recirculate our community's wealth? And so this is something you can invite others to imagine. The good food ecosystem is exemplified tonight. It was really cool that when I was chatting with Edie, I told her about how food co-ops, established co-ops, often hold these CSA fairs where they invite farmers to market their community-supported agriculture programs. And I was amazed to see that this is what happened here. So this is the good food ecosystem that food co-ops are a part of. There's often some fears that food co-ops will compete with farmers markets or CSAs. And the opposite seems to be true. Here is an example of a co-op in California that is the organizer of Nevada City Farmers Market. Here's a co-op in Chatham, New York that hosts the farmers market in their parking lot. On the right, you have a co-op in Illinois that has a pickup location for CSA boxes. And on the bottom right there is a co-op in Erie, Pennsylvania, where those CSA boxes are in the back of the store. So members are coming in and picking up those fresh veggies once a week, and then also buying other products on the shelves of the store. So this is part of that good food ecosystem. And moving from a relationship of seeing our food dollars as an expense and instead seeing it as an investment is another story that we can start to tell. So instead of looking at the bill and seeing a cost and an expense, we can actually look at that and say, what is it we're investing in? And of course, what we're investing in is all of these impacts I've been sharing. So helping ourselves and each other reframe our experience from expense into investment. Once again, profits and trust. Food co-ops cannot profit off of their customers. This is a really effective message. Store profit are customer profits. And you can remember this image. And one of the last contributions here would be the community contributions. Co-ops are amazing at giving to local community organizations. So here's an example of my co-op. Once a year, we publish all of the organizations that our co-op contributes to. This is pretty much every nonprofit in our community. Church groups, choirs, schools, all receive either money or food in donations. And this is a great way to talk up your co-op, that your co-op is not just about selling food, it's about supporting the community. And likely in my community, every single person I would ever talk to is engaged in one of these organizations, or their children are part of one of these organizations. And food co-ops, as alluded to earlier, are a supply chain diversity strategy. So we watched what happened with the Suez Canal blockage, how the entire supply chain around the planet for food and other things came to a halt. And then there's the changing weather patterns, the forest fires. In this case, this is the result of an atmospheric river in November 2021 that came into the Pacific Northwest, mostly through the lower mainland of British Columbia. And it did something that had never happened in British Columbia's history. It wiped out every major highway that connected Vancouver to the rest of the province. So I live 8 hours east of Vancouver. All the food that our co-op was getting, long distance food, not the local food, was coming from Vancouver. So this, again, led to empty shelves. And this is what our yogurt cooler looked like. The only thing on our shelves was the locally produced yogurt. So food co-ops are supply chain strategies also in the face of a changing climate and the impacts that we certainly know that are being had in California right now, which is really the breadbasket of the food system. So when I took this photo the other day, walking into my store, and I saw this truck from an hour away delivering sourdough pasta, I saw this as a supply chain diversity strategy and resilience. I saw the resilience of this. So food co-ops are more than just a grocery store, and this is an important piece to be able to talk about as well. They're community giving organizations. They generate value in a community. People want to live where there's a grocery store nearby. People specifically go find where the food co-op is, or even any grocery store that they can walk to or that's near close drive. They're a place of community connection. Food co-ops generally have cafes and seating areas. They're places you can stop and engage with your neighbors. We always joke at my co-op how there's no such thing as just walking into the co-op and grabbing one product, because next thing you know, you're having 5 or 6 conversations when you're in there. Which was great when we had to wear masks, because you could walk in and no one would recognize you. If you were in a rush, of course. But I generally like the connections. Co-ops are local economic development agencies, small business incubators. They're often advocates for causes, food and kitchen education and literacy, and they incubate other co-ops. Our co-op has been instrumental in incubating many of the other co-ops I mentioned that I'm a part of. So co-ops are more than a grocery store, and because they're more than a grocery store, this is a very resilient strategy for running a grocery store, because the community recognizes it not just as a place to buy food, but as something so much more important. And that, back to that durable model of ownership, it's the co-op model that preserves all of these things. It's that co-op model that preserves all of these roles that the grocery store plays. No private interest is going to sell these roles to anyone else. And so lastly, I just want to invite you, when you're talking about your co-op, to make sure you don't refer to your co-op as a they. This can often happen, especially if you're not on the board, to refer to what the co-op is doing as, oh yeah, the co-op, they're thinking of building a location over in that block of the city. And this happens with storefront food co-ops too, where I'll be talking with someone and they're like, oh yeah, the co-op, they're not selling this product anymore, and I'm upset. And I'll stop and ask them, well, aren't you an owner? And they reply with, well, yeah, I guess I am. And well, you can use the language then of we. You know, we've stopped carrying this product. Like when I walk into my co-op and I'm looking for a product, I don't say, hey, do you guys or do you folks have any of this? Or I say, hey, do we have any of that product from that farm? And like I say, I don't work there, I'm not on the board, but because I'm an owner, I'm using that language of we. And so I would encourage, as you build your communities and co-ops culture around this, to use that language of we, because that's what makes a co-op different, is that we can use that language of we when talking about our food co-op. And this might be the opening to any conversation. Who owns your grocery store? I have a page on my website called Who Owns Your Grocery Store. It lists every major banner in the US, which companies own them, and to just illustrate once again how much more interest there is in this topic, in the 4 years I've had this page active, I've watched just recently how there's been this spike in interest. So if you go to Google and you type in who owns grocery stores, the first result is this page of my website. About 85% of all the traffic that comes to my site is for that page. So this is a really important question to be tapping into. Who owns your grocery store? People are more and more interested in wanting to know. So become knowledgeable about who owns these other grocery stores in this area that people are shopping at. And of course, this is the answer if someone asks you. Once you open your doors. For now, you own a food co-op with a bunch of your friends. And here's what I hope is going to be happening in Kennett Square next time I'm here. There's going to be a sign somewhere, maybe just outside of town, maybe here in town. This is in Woodstock, Illinois. I took this image last year. They're just about to break ground. And here's also something you're going to be looking forward to, is the rendering of your new store. So I hope you agree with me that the future is cooperative. You know, that the age of private ownership, it serves its purpose. When it comes to food and groceries, I really think the future is cooperative, and of course we can bring these values into so many other aspects of our lives. If you haven't seen this yet, I published a photo book a couple years ago, which when people ask what a food co-op is, sometimes telling stories is not what works. Sometimes just looking at images works, especially if people have different ideas of what a food co-op is. As you've seen, food co-ops are grocery stores. They do a lot more, but they're grocery stores. So this is a photo book that shows not just inside of the grocery stores, thank you, not just inside of the grocery stores, but what food co-ops are doing, all these amazing initiatives. So I've got some copies downstairs that are available, but you can also look at this for free. I partnered with the Food Co-op Initiative to publish this. You can go onto my website and flip through this book. And lastly, last year, I launched a food co-op app. So one of the most effective ways for you to get excited about food co-ops and to encourage others to get excited is to go visit the ones that are open. So in Philadelphia, you've got 4 different co-ops, probably 6 different locations. Weaver's Way is building their 4th location right now in Germantown. So there's many food co-ops to visit. And you can also download this app, which wherever you are, where you're traveling, if you're in California or wherever, you can geolocate to the closest co-op using this app. And the food co-op sector helped fund this initiative. People would ask me all the time, or tell me all the time, I should say, when I was traveling, they would see me traveling from food co-op to food co-op, and they'd say, this is kind of what I do too. Anytime I travel, I look for the food co-op. That's how committed people can get to their food co-op. And so I felt like the natural extension was to build an app to help people find food co-ops. And so that's now on the Apple Store. And then that's the QR code for my site there. So thank you for your attention. And yeah, my pleasure.